So good evening. Simon Jacobson here. I welcome you all, everyone wherever you may be. And we shall talk about the soul's journey, one of the greatest and mysterious questions that people ask, which is, where does the soul go to after death? And the reason I chose this topic this week is because, in a puzzling way, this week's Torah chapter, every week has its corresponding Torah reading. So there are 52 weeks in the year. Every week has its own chapter. And each chapter consists of 7 sections. So 7 days of the week, 52 chapters. In effect, every day of the year has its corresponding section. So this week's Torah reading, which is the 5th chapter, the 5th chapter of the book of Genesis. So the name and title of the chapter, based on the first words of the chapter, is The Life of Sarah. And the puzzling thing about it is that it would seem like the chapter is going to tell you about the life of Sarah. You read a chapter heading or a title of a book and it's called The Life of Someone, you assume it's going to be their life. Instead, the chapter begins that this is the life of Sarah. She lived for 127 years and passed away. And the entire chapter talks about her death and the events that happened subsequent to her death, including Abraham buying a burial plot for her, which becomes Hebron, which till this day remains the Maras HaMachpelah in Hebron, that controversial spot where you have the patriarchs, Abraham and Sarah, and Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah, and they say also Adam and Eve are all buried there. Any of you have ever been there? Okay. So, and then it continues with the continuing story of all the events that take place as following her death, including Abraham sending his servant to go find the shidduch. This was the first version of J-Date, finding a match for his son Isaac. So why would the Torah call this chapter by the name Life of Sarah? Her life is actually related more in detail in last week's chapter, or 2 weeks ago, but last week primarily. So that itself begs a question, and therefore, obviously, it compels us to really think about what is life and what is death. And when we say someone is alive, what does it really mean to be alive? And then, of course, as I began, what is it that happens to us after death, if anything? Obviously, there are those that feel or believe that nothing happens. You simply are, body decomposes in the earth and it's all over, and that's that. But the real question is, how much do we really know about what's going on the other side of the curtain, so to speak? It's just because we have our own perspectives and myopic vision on this dimension, does that mean that nothing's happening elsewhere? That would be like the equivalent of a child or an ignorant person saying, since I don't see subatomic particles, and I don't see DNA, and I don't see other microscopic or submicroscopic elements, therefore they don't exist. Obviously it means you don't see it because our naked eyes are incapable, are containers that are not large enough to see it. If you use other instruments, you could see it. You could experience it. Maybe some things are not even seeable. Like, can one actually ever see love? Can one ever see pain? Yes, you can see its manifestation and its symptoms, but the root of it, just like we cannot see our psyches, we cannot see our souls. So there are things that are not defined by necessarily the tool called vision. That's all. This is what I'd like to address this evening. And beginning with that big question, where do we go? What happens to us after death? Where does the soul go to after death? Some of you will be familiar with the analogy I've given many times. First time I was ever asked this question, it struck me as odd, the question, because when you study the science of the soul, that question really doesn't even have a place. And I'll explain to you why. So somewhat with a tongue-in-cheek type of imaginary, little humorous type of dialogue, think of it this way. Imagine a conversation taking place between electricity and an appliance. Take any appliance that we're familiar with. It can be a refrigerator, it can be an air conditioner, it can be a light bulb, it can be an iPad. So here's the imaginary conversation. I'll use refrigerator. I like that one for some reason. Okay? So here's the conversation. Electricity asks the refrigerator, I'm sorry, the other way around. The refrigerator asks the electricity, where do you go when they pull the plug? You know? Again, bear with me, this is an imaginary conversation. It's not meant to be literal. For those of you that have not met me before, I just don't want you to think that I'm a little off the wall. I may be off the wall, but not for this reason. Okay? So the refrigerator asks the electricity, where do you go to when they pull the plug? They pull the plug up. And when I no longer have you running through me, the refrigerator asks. And the electricity obviously answers with incredulousness and like, what kind of chutzpah is this question? The whole question is based on a false premise. What do you mean where I go? I've always been around. The question is, where'd you come from? You're a little box that just came around last 100 or 200 years ago. Someone figured out how to refrigerate food. They created the technology that is able to efficiently do that. And the electricity, feed you, basically energy. So I just go back to where I always was, not contained by a little box like you. The nerve that you have to ask me where I go just demonstrates how narrow you are, because all you know is about your little box. So you can't see outside of your box. You can't see outside of your refrigerator. So you wonder where I go to. I go to that place which maybe doesn't occupy time and space, which of course the refrigerator cannot relate to, because its entire existence is based on a very narrow perspective for all its benefits. Now it's a simple analogy. When you think about it, it's quite logical. What do we know about energy, about electricity? So however you want to define a soul, and I'm not necessarily even suggesting a religious definition of the soul, call it energy. It's something. It's whatever you want to use the words. Even if one is not a non-believer, the difference between the moment before death and the moment after. The moment after, there's a corpse with all the organs. I don't want to sound morbid, but I'm just trying to make my point. A corpse with all the organs in place, the eyes and the ears and the heart and the mind. And let's, for argument's sake, say everything is functioning. And then a moment later, I'm saying a moment before all that was working, you could speak to this person, communicate, they were present, and then suddenly they're not. I tragically had the unfortunate experience to see that with my own father. So a moment this way and a moment that way, and I was there. You know, no one should ever have to see these things. It's painful enough, but the point is, what happens? So it's, at minimum, it's some form of electricity that left. Obviously, at maximum, the soul is a lot more than just electricity. You know, the person you love, the personality, it would be quite demeaning to call it just electricity. You know, there's a human being, and you continue to love that person even if they are physically not present. But as far as the analogy goes, I think it's an excellent way of looking at it. So the question itself, where do a soul go to, is based on a premise which itself is flawed. The premise is you think you are where it's at, just like the refrigerator thinks it's where it's at. And then you ask, where does the soul go to? Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the soul is where it's at, and it's the little time that it spends, 80, 90, 100, whatever years on this earth, is like the refrigerator, occupies a certain section of time and space, and that's what we barely can understand. You know, take it a step further. How much do we even know about life on earth, let alone beyond? I mean, what do we know about life? What do we know about, take the mind? With all the medical breakthroughs, and with all scientific knowledge today, the mind, that small little entity that's the size of your palm, like this, carries mysteries that any scientist, well, I can tell you, have yet to be discovered. We know very little about the mind. And that's just one aspect. Even the areas that we've mastered, and by no means am I in any way trying to belittle medicine and science. Obviously, they have saved lives, lifespan. I mean, things have changed dramatically, but still, the more we know doesn't mean we know it all. It means there are mysteries that continue. And this is just the frame of a body, 5-6 foot tall, human being like you and I, whatever, 100 pounds, 150 pounds. We don't have to go higher than that. 200 pounds. It doesn't really matter. I mean, in the scheme of things, what's 200 pounds, But the bottom line is, it's a very small, it's a very quantifiable and very easily identifiable measurement. It's small, relatively, and yet, in this small little entity, how many mysteries do we contain? And I'm not even getting now into our unconscious, and into our fears, into our insecurities, the things that affect you every second of your day. How many forces are at work that we're not even aware of, that are shaping our decisions, that are creating indecisiveness, that paralyze us, that don't allow us to have healthy relationships. All going on in this little body of yours or mine. So the point of making is that any honest appraisal of this is clearly that we know very little. We know probably less than a refrigerator does about electricity than about what is the true life force that really gives us energy. So then you could say, okay, with that point being stated, the class should be over. That's it. I made my statement that we know very little, and what else can be said? However, there's a lot that can be said. Once you get over this first step of at least knowing what you don't know, or acknowledging that you don't know, interestingly, you can begin to start knowing it. You see, our biggest trap is arrogance, always. Thinking that you have it figured out. When you think you have it figured out, obviously, and you don't, you are your own worst enemy. Because at least knowing that there's a bigger picture leaves a certain receptivity and openness. I don't know, so I'll read, I'll study, I'll listen, I'll consult. But when you think you know, or you think, let's say in the case of the refrigerator, let's say it didn't have this dialogue with electricity, it would be convinced that it hasn't worked out, and that's it. But when you ask that question, suddenly the refrigerator, or in our case, our box, suddenly says, okay, 1 second. So if that's the case, that the soul is where it's at, and we're not where it's at, then what is going on in that world? And here, the good news is that there are hundreds, if not thousands of pages discussed about the soul's journey. And it's not based purely on faith, believing that something is there. It's when you allow yourself to not be convinced that you have it all, that you're where it's at, that you begin to actually can have an experience that is beyond. And you can actually go to that place. So, where the poets and the singers and the artists and the authors throughout history have all aspired to find out what's going on the other side. Breaking through to the other side is one of the key expressions coined by one of the rock bands of the 60s. But it goes back to, named after Blake's statement about cleansing the doors of perception. Everything is infinite. And even those that did not experience psychedelics and always aspired to that other side. Some call it, in Hebrew we use the expression in the Yom Kippur prayer, Ma'achere HaPargut. What's going on the other side of the curtain, behind the curtain. Expressions of going to paradise. Expressions of knocking on heaven's door. The going down the rabbit hole. I mean, I can give you a whole list of words, litany of expressions of the aspiration of someone trying to find out what happens on the other side. And in essence, that's really the big question, because relating to that can allow us to appreciate our own existence in a different way. And that's what I submit is the key reason that the chapter in this week's Torah is named, particularly in a very provocative way, because it forces you to start thinking, if this chapter was named the death of Sarah, okay, that would be obvious. It talks about her death. The fact that her death and the events following her death are called the life of Sarah force us to start thinking, what is life and what is death? Maybe life really begins after what we call death. If, as I said, electricity is confined in a refrigerator, where does electricity really experience itself in an unbridled and in full glory? Not when it's contained or trapped in a box, but when it is when it's unfettered, when it's not trapped. So you could argue that the deepest soul's experience real life is not when a soul is trapped in a body, but when a soul is without a body. Now, I understand you may say, well, how does that help us, in this earth and when we are in bodies? But if that's true, then that is exactly what the mystics and all the great seekers always looked for. They wanted to have that experience in the body, to have an out-of-body experience in the body, if you want to put it that way. And there's an expression, "Elamcha tir b'chayecha," that you should see your world, meaning the world to come, or the great, deeper worlds in your lifetime. It's a blessing. It's considered a gift to be able to experience in our lifetime, while we're confined in this box called material life, to experience that which is beyond. But the first prerequisite for it all, which I shall definitely elaborate upon later, is what we call bittul. The ability to suspend your own perspective, because without that perspective traps and doesn't allow us to experience that which is beyond us. And this is true across the board. There is no growth and there is no journey anywhere if you remain trapped in your perspective. Simple as that. No matter how brilliant you are, it's still going to be a confined and defined and subjective perspective. Like the classic story, the joke from the city of Chelm. I've shared this many times, but it captures it well. Where Chelm was this little town in Poland. And there's a whole folklore of parables and stories and jokes on the expense of these Chelm townspeople, of their foolishness. They say actually Chelm were really wise people actually that lived there, but their neighbors were resentful, so they created all these like stupid jokes. But they all have very profound psychological insights. So here's the story with the Chelm farmer. So Chelm was a small town, so you could imagine the farm on Chelm was also quite small. But one day but this farm, even though it was a small farm, it was his baby, this farmer, because he had inherited this farm from his parents and grandparents and generations back. So every grain of soil was like his baby. He cared for it, nurtured it, as it was his personal. So one day he receives a guest, and the guest is a big town farmer from another part of the world called the United States. And in the United States, the farms are a little bigger than what's going on in Europe, especially in this Chelm town. So the day comes, this guest happens to be his cousin. He shows him around. The Chelm farmer shows his guest around. Chelm farm, so proud. They sit down to dinner, and the Chelm farmer, wanting to get a good compliment, says to his cousin, "So what do you think about my farm here in Chelm?" He says, "It's very nice and cute, but it's so tiny." And the Chelm farmer is taken aback, insulted. This is his baby, you remember? "What do you mean it's so tiny? How big is your farm in Texas?" Or wherever he comes from. She says, so he's looking for a point of reference. So he tells his cousin, he says, "My farm in Texas, it takes me all day to travel from one end of with my tractor to travel from one end of the farm to the next." The Chelm farmer suddenly, feels compassion and empathy for his cousin. He says, "Don't feel bad. I once had a tractor like that too." Okay? So the Chelm farmer was not being malicious or trying to be cute or anything. He couldn't fathom a farm that large. He never saw anything like it. And even in his imagination, you can't imagine something that's not, at least in the realm of possibility. We don't imagine certain things. So for instance, if we were to pass out a questionnaire here, and you were asked the question, are you narrow-minded, closed-minded, or open-minded? Are you objective or subjective? How many people do you think are going to check off the box, I'm narrow-minded, closed-minded? I mean, unless they're trying to be funny, but most people are not going to mark. Because you have to remember, subjectivity makes you think you're objective, obviously. So this Chelm farmer could have been a very pure guy, innocent. But remember, our perspective is not about truth or not truth. It's about, our objectivity is only as good as our perspective is. For him, a farm, he had his parameters of what a farm. A large farm, okay, a little bigger than mine. How much bigger could it be? So in his mind, it must be with the vehicle. Problem is not this is such a large farm. So he felt bad, because he remembers he once had a shmata jalopy just like that. That took him all day to crank up. We all have those experiences. You spend the entire day to move something from here to there. So that's what he was convinced. That was the reason that it took him all day. So we all have our little farms, everyone. No matter how sophisticated or educated and literate you may be, we all have our farms. That doesn't mean, obviously, some people have vast amounts of knowledge, are very educated, and some less. But everybody is subjective, because everybody has subjective experiences, attitudes to things. Attitudes that have shaped you long before you had any choice. Attitudes that are imposed upon us by our parents, by our cultures, by our communities, for good or for bad. But to say that you're just a clean slate, everything, you're open, you're objective to anything, that's absolutely not true. No one is that way. Now that's not a criticism of the human race, because how do people get beyond that is acknowledging that. That's the only thing that's necessary. Acknowledge it. So to speak, recuse yourself from a situation if your subjectivity may be biasing you. Or in your own mind, you want to find the truth to something, the first step is you have to get out of the way. In Hebrew, as I mentioned before, there's a word that's called bittul. Bittul means, it's a Hasidic expression, it's also used in Talmudic terms, referring to laws of kosher, and one thing is how one thing gets nullified by other things, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a psychological state where you suspend yourself to allow in a new perspective. That is the first sign of intelligence. Intelligence is not how brilliant you are. It's the humility to be able to allow in new intelligence. Because as brilliant as you may be, it's still your brilliance, and it's going to be subjective. Somewhere you'll be subjective. Whereas that first step of acknowledging that there's something beyond you, that allows you to be receptive and know you can trust yourself. And others can trust you because they know that you're not trapped in your own ideas. And if another idea comes your way, and something that contradicts whatever it is that you knew, you're open to hearing, that's called growth. And don't think it's that simple. It's not that simple. It's easier said than done. In topics like abstract sciences like mathematics or physics and stuff like that, it's easier in a way. Unless you're invested in a conclusion because you spent a long time. And you see, even great scientists forge and are caught with unethical behavior because they're invested in something. They're invested in success. They may be frustrated, etc. But where it gets more complicated is not in academic areas. It gets more complicated in personal areas. You can be the most brilliant person, doesn't mean you don't have personal interests. So in areas of relationships, areas of dealing with parents, children, love, pain, being hurt, there nobody, no matter what, the most educated person is not immune from being biased for obvious reasons. Which is how the Torah captures it. The Torah captures it in one sentence by saying, Hasheched ya'aver einei chachamim, which means bias or bribery, blinds the eyes of the wise. Salaf tzivrei tzadikim, it distorts the tongue, the mouth of the righteous. And the Torah calls this person chachamim and tzadikim. And not as a euphemism, as actual, this is a real wise person. Now, if a person can be so biased that it distorts that it blinds the eyes or distorts his speech, his thinking, you wouldn't call such a person wise or a tzaddik. But the Torah is making a very big point that there's nobody immune to it. Everyone, the wisest, the greatest tzaddik, can be biased and is biased. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. That's the way we've been created. We have a certain need to preserve your own life. If you were not biased, you would not protect your own life. You'd be so oblivious to yourself. So there's a need to have chayecha kaidmin, to take care of your life. And that requires certain subjective interest, that yes, that you feel your pain. No one else can feel your pain for you. However, what makes someone truly a truly great person is they don't get trapped by their biases, because they know they're biased. So it's not like the guy, and this has happened to me more than once, so this isn't just theoretical, who says, yes, I have blind spots, but I know what they are. That's like the doctor that tells you, I'll tell you when you need a second opinion. The whole point is a second opinion not from this doctor. You want to hear someone else, not when he tells you you need it. Because it's another subtle form of control, or maybe not so subtle. So that the ability to recognize that is the key to real wisdom. And you'll see throughout history, the people who truly reached the greatest heights were not just the most brilliant people. It was the people who were able to suspend the way everyone thinks about things and go completely to another place. Einstein said it, and Steve Jobs said it. They all said the same, I think. It was all about getting away from what you know. not from what you, not doing what you know. That's when you really can achieve completely different, you can enter into a different stratosphere, take a quantum leap, because it's not based on your experience, it's based on something beyond your experience. And that's when you can dream and imagine things that are far beyond your own perspective. Now that's not easy to do. It's not easy to. And everyone likes to think that think that they think out of the box. You know, think out of the box. You hear it all the time. You know, and who is it that sells the? What do they sell? Called the, out of the bun. Which company is it? Domino's. One of these. Huh? Taco Bell. Okay, fine, good. So it's a great line if you think out of the box, but it's like, how many people truly think out of the box? Is it even easy to think out of the box? As I said, with so many forces that shaped our box, we don't even know what our box may be like. To first know you're in a box, and first know the parameters, maybe you're out of the box is really part of your box. How do you know? You know? So it's a cute and it's a great line to use, and it sounds like so adventurous and bold and courageous, but it's not that simple. And even if you end up thinking sometimes out of the box, how many people act on it? One thing thinking about it, it's an exercise in fantasy. Another is to act on it. And there, the traps that I mentioned, the fears, insecurities, are all come in the way, because whether we like it or not, the known evil is always easier than the unknown one. So even if you know your life is not working out so well, it's much more riskier psychologically for many of us to try something new, because it may be worse in our minds, especially if you think of life in that type of fatalistic way. So there are many forces, therefore, that keep us trapped. And this discussion, as I said, this chapter talking about the death in the context of life, is meant to provoke us specifically. There's an expression in the Talmud that goes like this: Tzaddikim, righteous people, even in their deaths, gam b'misosam kriyim chayim, even in their death they're called alive. And Rishoyim, wicked people, gam b'chayim kriyim mesim, even in their lifetimes they're called dead. Now, that's obviously just continues this provocative theme. What does that mean? So obviously if you ask a doctor or a scientist or an average person in the street, what is life and death? So you'll get a certain clinical definition. If a person is breathing, if their heart is pumping, their brain is working, it's called being alive. And yes, God forbid, there are people perhaps in comas or like vegetables, but they're technically alive. Because there's a medical definition of life. Torah also has a definition of biological life. Is it breath? Is it the heart beating? Torah, it's actually breath is a key element. Which is a whole discussion about what happens if there's a discrepancy, for example, heart transplants. Torah perspective is not such a simple matter. Not that it can't be done, but there's issues involved, because you cannot take away an organ from someone that's considered alive from the Torah point of view. Now what happens if doctors call him dead, but the Torah still says he's alive, based on different criteria? But I'm not going there, there's not a discussion on this topic. So the definition of life that most of us would say is, as I said earlier, certain criteria. The Talmud, this statement that I just made, has a different definition of life. You could have somebody who is completely functional, and every one of their faculties is working perfectly, humming along, and will tell you, how do you feel today? I feel like I'm dead. I feel like a zombie. What happens when people have heartbreak? Real disappointments. So your body can be functioning perfectly well. I'm sure psychological pain is going to ultimately have effect also on our health. But let's, for argument's sake, the health is intact at this point. People will say that. I feel like I'm dead. I feel my life. Because obviously life is more than just biological function. So actually in the Torah, in Judaism, there's really 5 definitions of life. Or maybe put it this way, 5 dimensions of the soul. You may have heard this: nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida. 5 names. But they're not just 5 names, they're actually 5 dimensions. Nefesh, when you say something has a nefesh, you're saying that it is biologically alive. It's functioning. But that can be on the minimum level, a standard we don't want to experience. Because that means there's the bare minimum of functioning. The next level, sometimes life is called ruach, Nefesh, ruach, neshama. Ruach, which means it can be wind, it can be spirit, but it's another definition, another dimension of the soul. That's called emotional life. So you can be biologically alive, but emotionally feel dead. Now, are you clinically dead? No, you're not dead, obviously, from a biological point of view, but you're dead from an emotional point of view. You don't feel, or you may feel numb, paralyzed, you feel nothing, or feel worse, you feel opposite. What is the nothing? There must be some word for it. You feel horrible. That's where is the nothing. Then there's neshama, which is maybe more the common word used for soul, but they're all used. Nefesh is used, ruach, and neshama is the third. Neshama is intellectual life, which means not just that you're biologically functioning and surviving, not just emotional experience, you're also intellectually alive. An example of emotional without intellectual would be, you could be emotionally alive, a lot of emotions are alive, but your mind is not stimulated. Many times we can get trapped in all kinds of hedonistic emotions without any type of sublime element to it that the mind offers. Okay. Then there's two final dimensions. One is called CHAYA, one is called Yechida. So CHAYA literally means life. You could say CHAYA is life, CHAYA is CHAYA. But in this context, this is already a transcendent dimension to life. So you could have biological, emotional, intellectual, but lacking transcendence. Lacking transcendence. Lacking that, the angst or the aspiration to something beyond. And that transcendence for many people is expressed, can be in many different ways. Music, for instance, art, travel, romance. And I don't mean just the emotional element of it. I mean the journey to another place type of thing. And of course, spirituality, religion for some, is a transcendent experience. And finally, the fifth dimension, Yechida, which is harder to define, is really the essence of a human experience. It's the essence of the soul, or as close as we can get to the essence. It's almost a place which you don't really experience, it emerges. So it's interesting, in Jewish tradition, there are 3 prayers daily. On Shabbat and holidays, Shabbos and holidays, there are 4 prayers. And on Yom Kippur, the only day of the year, there's 5. It's not an accident, it's not coincidence. It's because, generally speaking, we have access to the 3 dimensions of Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, and hence the 3 prayers, daily prayers. Shabbat and holidays, we are able to experience the transcendence, so you add additional musaf, an additional prayer. And Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, we're able to enter the Holy of Holies of your own spirit and psyche, soul, and therefore the 5th Ne'ilah prayer. I don't want to go into detail on this, I've discussed it other times. My point that I want to lead to is that when we define life, it's much more complicated than just saying, I'm alive. Yes, technically when a seed is fertilized, it starts and conceives, you conceive and a fetus begins to grow. Technically you can say life has begun. Well, maybe throughout pregnancy different stages emerge. A child emerges from the womb upon birth. Some call that the beginning of life. But then the child develops. And I think I've discussed this back in the summer, that there's, the Kabbalah talks about 3 stages of maturity. It's called Ibur Yanike Moichin, or sometimes used Mutva, Murgish, and Muskel. But beyond the Hebrew, what it really means is that there are 3 stages that are really determined of how the intellect matures and how it impacts the emotions. So a newborn child is driven primarily by emotion. It's hungry, it cries. There's no talking logic, there's no patience, there's no tolerating, there's no coexisting with others. And it's not because the child chooses to be selfish, so therefore it's not a bad thing. At that stage it's necessary for a child's survival. Just like 9 months in his mother's womb, so the Kabbalah says, why is a child in a fetal position? Because the head and the heart are all rolled into the legs essentially, because the main function there is functionality. It's growing. You cannot expect the mind and the heart to be fully developed, so therefore the emotions and the mind are not yet fully expressed. And essentially you can define maturity is going from being an emotionally driven creature that is driven by impulse and needs, my needs, me, to coming to understand with your mind and ultimately emotionally as well, that there's more to life than just me. Now, for a child to be a narcissist, that's the way it's meant to be. Where it's a crime is when an adult is a narcissist. Because an adult is not supposed to be a narcissist. Child, that's the way God created. Child is dependent on its parents for survival, especially early stages. But if we don't grow up, so chronologically you can grow into an adult, but it doesn't mean you are an adult. It just means that you, in age and in size, are an adult. But when it comes to, when you really want to define an adult from a Torah point of view, adult is someone whose soul has learned to express itself. So maturity is intellectual and emotional maturity, where you come to realize it's not just your perspective on life that matters. There's a bigger picture. Unfortunately, this is something that we're not taught. You either learn it by experience, trial and error. Most of us learn it by real mistakes. Either you hit rock bottom and you realize you don't have it figured out, or something, crisis, some trauma, something that breaks or challenges your perspective that you realize, hey, maybe there's another way to look at it. What I'm here to tell you is that you don't have to wait for crisis and trauma and rock bottom to wake up. That if you apply yourself and if you're an intelligent person, you realize that our farm is always limited. So making a statement that the death of Sarah is really called her life, challenge us to define what about our lives. Are you alive or are you dead? Now I don't mean that in a obviously literal sense, but where are your emotions and intellect stand? And how alive are you? How much of your soul is being actualized? Or let's put it maybe more psychological terms. How much of your potential is being actualized? How much remains dormant and lying asleep within your soul and within your psyche, and how much is being expressed? And I go back to the reason that it's mostly not being expressed is usually due to our comfort zones, our fears, and whatever it is that keeps us shaped, that shapes us, and above all, as I said, the thing that keeps us thinking that we have it figured out, that we are pretty good, with a little tweaking we'll be better. Now, by no means am I suggesting that anyone here is not good, we're all great, but as they say in Yiddish, if good is besser is besser, which means if you're good is better, not better. So as great as you are, the key thing is to realize that as you climb the mountain, the horizons broaden, and you see bigger realities. When you study Torah properly, and I emphasize the word properly, and I'll tell you in a moment why. When you study it properly, that's really what the Torah does. It challenges your perspective on life and experience. Now, why did I say properly? Because many of you will say, well, I went to yeshiva, and I know yeshiva people who know a lot of Torah, and I don't see them actually having any broad perspective at all. Many of them are narrow-minded as it gets, and religion can be actually a very constricting and a closed-minded experience. No? And I wouldn't disagree with you. That's why I said properly. See, here's an interesting Mishnah that says in the Pirkei Avos, it says, Ethics of the Fathers, it says, Ein lecha ben chayrin el misha esik b'Torah. Translated loosely, it means you're not a free person unless you study Torah. Okay, 1 second. But that's a very, it's going to even be like a racist statement. But remember, think about it. The Mishnah does not say that if you study Torah, you're a free person. It says you can't be free unless you study Torah. So you could study Torah and not be free at all because you're not studying Torah the way it's supposed to be studied. If the Torah, and I only say if, just to play devil's advocate, the voice of the skeptic, if it is truly a divine mandate and a divine wisdom, so the first above all thing that the Torah should be doing is showing us a perspective that is beyond me. It's meant to open your mind to realize there's a bigger reality than yourself. Now, here's not the place or the time to go into an analysis how the Torah was hijacked and ended up becoming a force of narrow-mindedness and bigotry and condescension and judgmentalism and all that. But when you look at the great true Torah giants in history, the people who really were pioneered it, Abraham, Moses, and others like that, their perspective on life was extremely nonconformist, extremely open-minded, and for them the Torah was an emancipating experience. It was showing them a perspective from a bird's eye view of reality instead of looking at it from the ground level. And that's why it says that you cannot be free without it, because without some type of perspective that's beyond you, how could you ever be free? As I said, you're only as free as your subjective wisdom or intelligence allows you to be. Like that Chelm farmer, is he free? Yeah, he's free technically, but he's as free as his mind is as free as his farm is, meaning the size of his farm. So the idea of understanding life and death in this fashion takes on a whole different shape and form. Now, before I continue, I just want to make an important disclaimer. In Buddhism, a lot of the Far Eastern disciplines, especially in Tibetan philosophy, so everyone's heard the Tibetan book of death, of the dead, and there are different variations of it. So there's a lot of focus in the Far Eastern thinking of how that the greatest fear a human being has is death, is the end, to think that everything ends. And people will do everything, and some even theorize that most of the human ambition and drive is to some way minimize the impact of death, which is why we try to immortalize ourselves. The pharaohs tried to do it through the pyramids. Today there's, the cryogenic freezing. There's all kinds of ways. And other people do it through vanity and through ego, some way leaving a legacy. And in Buddhism, the approach, which I will contrast to Judaism, is that ultimately to teach a person that life on earth should not be valued that much, and understand that life is on the spirit level. And therefore they're not to think of death as the end, but to think of death almost as the beginning. The interesting contrast to Jewish thinking, and there are many similarities, that's why I bring it up, because some of you may be familiar with it. In Jewish thinking, the interesting thing is there's no question that the soul continues its journey even after its short span of time that it spends on earth. But in Judaism we do cherish life, because the purpose is that the electricity should be in a box, and the box should experience that which is outside of the box. So it's not about aspiring to just go to that place. It's about connecting that place to our place. You understand the distinction? I'll just give it to you in a context a little more, a little more Talmudic. There's a debate, there's an argument between two greats. One is the Rambam and one is the Ramban. The difference between them, one is Maimonides, one is called Nachmanides. Maimonides lived around 1,000 years ago. Nachmanides around 900 years ago. And the debate was, what is the ultimate reward for human beings' efforts on this earth? So you'll know the world, Olam Haba, the world to come, which is like in a sense a reward for this world. Maimonides makes it clear the world to come is not to come as in time, it comes afterwards. It's cause and effect. Essentially, heaven is what you create with your actions. So it's not some place between Mars and Venus or beyond the solar system. It's a spiritual type of reward for your behavior, cause and effect. Okay. So the debate, the argument that they have is, the ultimate reward, will it be for souls alone or for souls within bodies? So in Jewish thought there's the concept that we say in the prayer every day of resurrection, which is another discussion. What does that mean? Well, just to make it a little palatable, shouldn't sound so crazy. Just like I said earlier, that the question of where does the soul go to after death is similar to a refrigerator asking electricity where it goes to when they pull the plug. The same thing, let's pose another type of question, and that is, if the soul is energy and electricity, why is it that at some point there will be death? Why? Think of it like this. If you poured the liquid water into a cup, and just for argument's sake, there's no effects of evaporation, is there any reason that the water should ever leave that cup? Or electricity energizing an appliance. The only reason would be is if you stop the flow of electricity or the appliance breaks down. But if neither of those two things happens, why should there ever be a reason of a cessation of that fusion? Which is why the Bible says that when Adam and Eve were put into the Garden of Eden, God says to them, do not eat from the tree of knowledge. The day you eat from it, you will die. Which implies that if they did not eat from it, they would never have died. What does that mean? It means the following. That a soul is an infinite force of energy. It has no reason to ever leave a human body. The only reason would be the equivalent of the cup and the water is if the body gets punctured. The cup gets punctured, so ultimately the water is going to leak out. If there was a seamless flow between material and the spiritual, death would not be possible. So the concept of death from a Torah point of view, the pain of death, is not just, and I'm not saying it's just as a minimalization, but it's not just that we are no longer in touch with those that we loved. It's because it reflects on a fundamental flaw that matter and spirit are not seamless, are not aligned. And that's why a soul can see us and we can't see it. The pain is therefore the disconnect, the finality of the disconnection. So in your memories and your heart, you can continue to love someone that's passed on. And you can love them just as you loved them when they were here. But what's missing is you cannot touch them. You can't look at them. You can't speak to them as we speak to each other on this earth. And even people of spirit who don't see the material world as such a serious entity, still, from a Jewish perspective, there's something about the material world that's critical. And this is where the Rambam, going back to their disagreement. So the Rambam holds, consistent to his approach to many things, that ultimate reward is a spirit without a body. Because a body at the end of the day limits, as I said, the refrigerator confines the flow of electricity. The body has to in some way compromise the true spiritual experience. That's Maimonides' theory. Nachmanides disagrees and says that since God is neither divine, well, he doesn't say this is how it's explained, that since God is neither spirit nor matter, and beyond both, why would it be a problem that spirit and matter to join together, and the ultimate reward would be neshama's bigufim, a soul outside of a body. And that's his opinion, and Kabbalistic and Hasidic thought rule on this, and they rule like Nachmanides, not like Maimonides. This is a very subtle distinction of what I would compare with Far Eastern and Jewish thinking. So what does that lead us to in this discussion here? Like this, that the soul is an entity that we have very little knowledge of. As I said, even the human brain, which is a physical force and can be physically observed, is a mystery. I once asked a neurologist, neurosurgeon, and asked him, "What you've studied brains? Tell me, you look at this brain that's like the palm of your hand. It's made up of physical components. How many ideas can rest in the brain?" And he began to laugh and he said to me, "We have no idea. We just know how it works. We know that it works. We know that this brain, for some reason, charges neurons, and when these neurons start reacting to each other, they create miracles. How? We don't know exactly." He says, "I don't know if we'll ever know." So clearly, you have here a physical entity that is definitely generating some type of something that isn't physical, at least not in the technical sense of it. Ideas. How many ideas can your brain hold? You want to know what your hard drive can hold? Open up your computer and it'll tell you these are the limits. 500 gig, 1,000 gig. What's after gigs? What do they call them? Whatever. The terabytes, right? And maybe it'll grow. It'll be terabytes. I don't know what's after terabytes. I didn't get there yet, right? But it's something up there. Okay. So there's a limit, and when you reach the limit, the hard drive is going to tell you that you have no more room. How many ideas can go into your brain? And the brain, it's not, and we all know it's not about size, obviously. And how many ideas? No clue. How many ideas do you even carry in your brain? You don't even know how many things are in your memory, in your invisible memory. The point I'm making here is that when you're talking about a soul itself, we know nothing about it because we can't even observe it. We can only observe it through our life experiences. So Judaism's thinking is like this, that you rather really understand the experience of the soul. So let's take the life of Sarah. You want to know when someone is really alive? You have to see what they're like after they're physically not here. Because as long as they're physically here, you could say their physical presence is dominant. You could say that their influence, people fear them, etc., etc. That we could sit here 3,700 years later and talk about Sarah as our mother. We know where she's buried, where she walked. Think about that. Is that called death? So physically she's not here, but she may be more alive than many people walking on this earth. She doesn't have the biological dimension, but she has the ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida. And that's why the Talmud says that even in their lifetimes, wicked people are called dead, and righteous people are called alive even in their deaths. It's a it's a redefinition of life and death, basically. Now, this is not theoretical at all. It comes down to very practical. It's about how we can resurrect ourselves, if you want to put it that way. How we can reinvigorate, rejuvenate our own lives. And that is understanding what life is really about. The fact is, whether we like it or not, most of us, most of the time, are consumed with survival. When I say that, I don't mean necessarily only because you may not be able to make ends meet. Some people have a lot of money and they're still consumed with survival. Because anything that is materialistic sustenance, whether it's money or food or anything else that the so-called here and now needs to survive, is survival. And that's biological at the end of the day.